Good day. This is Khawaja Hammad Akbar.
And I'm Robert Fantina. You're listening to Geopolitics, exploring myth versus reality. Each week, we interview distinguished experts from around the world to explain and clarify the most pressing international issues of the day.
And today we have with us Professor Dr. Kristen Kaunert, who is Professor of International Security at Dublin City University, Ireland. He's also Professor of Policing and Security, as well as Director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. In addition, he is Jane Monnet Chair, Director of the Jane Monnet Center of Excellence, and Director of the Jane Monnet Network on EU Counterterrorism. Thank you, Kristen, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be there with you.
Okay, Christian, again, thank you. And I will start. Right now, of course, the war in Ukraine is on everybody's mind. How does this war impact European security in your view?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a great question because obviously Ukraine is really the one big issue that has been on most of European policymakers' mind. Most academics have been thinking about it. Why? Because obviously it is the first time that we've really seen outright war since the Second World War. Obviously, we've had wars like the civil wars in Yugoslavia and other kind of conflicts on European territory, but this is the first time in a European understanding that it challenges very much some of the ideas for which the European Union was built, which was precisely to engage more, to do more trade, to deal with one another in return for their being in a sense, a peaceful security environment. And this is the first time that we've seen since the Second World War that we have an outright invasion of another country, an independent country, in the European space. So as part of that, this is very much on most people's mind, European policymakers. This is at the forefront of what most people think about in terms of European security. It challenges a lot of the ideas that policymakers and also presumably individual citizens have had about European security. The German Chancellor Scholz, he talked about the so-called Zeitenwende, meaning that really this is a total change of an epoch, a total change of an era, where we used to think we were in a peaceful security neighborhood, and now we have an outright war that we haven't seen in such a way since the Second World War. So this is a really a significant moment in our history.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see that impacting NATO, bringing Ukraine into NATO, and how will it impact security structure within the EU? Do you see changes there?
Yes, I think let's not talk about Ukraine and NATO yet. Let's look at the other issues first. The first two things on the agenda, and the most immediate things on the agenda, is of course the admission of Sweden and Finland into NATO. This has been signed off. This has been ratified by most countries. There's only two countries outstanding in terms of the ratification. One of them is Hungary and one of them is Turkey. Hungary has not mentioned, at least overtly, that they want to block it. Turkey has put a number of conditions on their membership, but in general, it is expected that both Sweden and Finland will join NATO over the next couple of months. This should be something that will happen quite imminently, and this is a very, very significant change in the European security structure. Why? Because, of course, Sweden, but also Finland, in particular Finland, also were the symbols of the kind of neutral states, the states that were, in a sense, wedged between the West, if you like, and at the time the Soviet Union, and they perceived that by being neutral, they would have more security. By being neutral, they could stay out of the alignment, and as a result of that, they would be able to feel secure. They wouldn't feel like they might be attacked. Now, a direct result of the war in Ukraine, of the invasion of Ukraine, has been that those countries no longer feel that way. They no longer feel that as neutrals, they can continue to be secure. They see themselves very much at the first of the target lists, potentially, of the Kremlin. And of course, there were a number of threats before the decision was made to join NATO, that they could now put themselves in the firing line and so on. Didn't actually happen then with both Finland and Sweden. So this is changing the immediate dynamic in terms of NATO. So the neutrals are becoming much, much less. There's much less in terms of, and also NATO is massively increasing its direct border to Russia, because Finland on its own has about 1/3 of the border that NATO has with Russia. So this is a very, very significant increase of a direct border between NATO and Russia. So it's huge in terms of security implications. It has massive implications also on the European Union, because the European Union intended, obviously, over the last couple of years to deal far more with security issues. It's been developing a common foreign security policy. It's obviously also dealt with internal security, counterterrorism, and a number of other issues. But in particular, there's been the ambition to create a European foreign security policy. There was a creation of a new institution, a European External Action Service, that was a direct response to Europe acting more and doing more in terms of foreign security policy. But it's always been wedged in between. Does that mean a European policy that is different from NATO, or does that mean a European policy that is complementing NATO? Now, different countries in Europe always had different visions of what that European foreign security policy might mean. But what we have now is that we have a much, much bigger overlap between NATO and the EU than what we had prior to the war in Ukraine. And that ultimately, in a sense, answers that question, whether there's going to be a policy independent of NATO or complementing NATO, because it can only be a policy complementing NATO if indeed most of the EU is also a member of NATO. So in that sense, it kind of answers that dichotomy that has been, and in fact, Russia pushed the EU to answer that question, only that the question is now not answered in the way that Russia wanted it to be answered, but it's answered in the negative, if you like.
Thank you.
So, listen, Ken, thank you for covering this question, but this brings me to the secondary question. Is that the European nations are very much concerned about the Russian and Ukraine conflict at the moment. And they were looking at NATO, but NATO does not respond in a way that it has to, or it has committed to respond. Because President Zelensky was begging to NATO to come and help, but they didn't. So it's not this itself a question on the practical or tactical use of NATO in Europe. Will European Union consider to build its military arm as indigenous military arm?
I think it depends always what you expect from NATO. Of course, Zelensky would have preferred a direct intervention by NATO. He would have preferred an increasing military support. You can understand that, especially when, you know, one of the last remaining great powers invades your space and invades your country. You expect that hopefully NATO can help you. Now, NATO has been careful, of course, to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia. They don't want a military conflict. They don't want war, a direct war between NATO and Russia. And as a result of that, they've made it very clear that they're not going to intervene militarily as such. Now, that is NATO as an alliance, because NATO is, of course, also a defensive alliance. NATO is a defensive alliance that only acts according, let's say, to Article 5, when one of its members is militarily attacked. Now, this is not the case at this particular moment, because, of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And none of the other member states of NATO so far has been attacked by Russia. And of course, Russia has been also saying that they're not going to. And in the same way, NATO has been saying that they're not going to engage militarily either. However, what has happened is, of course, that both sides have provided support. So of course, the Ukrainian side has had military support in the sense of weapon deliveries and in the sense of training, in a sense of general help with strategy of warfare by a number of European countries, by a number of Western countries, more generally, also, of course, the United States at the forefront of that, Canada, Australia, and a number of other Western countries. Russia itself has also had military support by a number of countries. It has military support, notably also from Iran, the drone issue and so on, and then from other countries also. They've been hoping also a little bit more and have been trying to get China more directly involved. So far, China has been quite careful about that conflict also and not wanting to be directly involved. And as a result of that, we've had the conflict localized, if you like. So there's been involvement in the sense of helping in terms of weapons, in terms of strategic aspects to the conflict, but there hasn't been a direct involvement in terms of direct military conflict between NATO and Russia, and neither has there been between Eastern countries like China or Iran that are not directly involved in conflict, but that Iran, for instance, that does provide weapons, of course, to Russia.
Oh, this brings me, Kristen, to the second question that you were talking about, the Russian objective, or making it very relative or domestic affair of Europe, is about how you assess the territorial, in terms of territorial expansion, the Russian objectives in Europe.
Mm-hmm. The immediate objective that the Russians have had is obviously, like President Putin had been pointing out on a number of different occasions, the Ukrainian nation for him doesn't exist. Ukraine is not an independent country as such for him. That is his primary military objective, if you like. He wants to integrate whatever is, according to him, not a nation into Russia. He obviously started that with Crimea at that beginning. He then tried to integrate further Luhansk, Donetsk, and some of the other regions. He was aiming for a lot more. So he was aiming to obviously invade Kiev. He was aiming to topple the government. A number of people were saying that he hoped that as soon as the Russian forces would come in, the government would fall, that perhaps Zelensky would flee the country, a little bit like what we saw in Afghanistan with the fall of Afghanistan. Nothing of the sort happened, of course, in Ukraine. And in fact, he had to kind of concede that, in a sense, he didn't get very far in the territories that he thought he could overwhelm. So then he kind of retracted somewhat. He stayed within the eastern Ukrainian regions, primarily Donetsk, Luhansk, and a kind of land bridge, if you will, from Russia towards Crimea, so that he has, or he's aiming to establish a direct connection between Crimea and Russia, and also to bring Crimea more closely to Russia. And this is where the war is currently, during the winter now, at a stalemate, where we're seeing that, in a sense, he's not able to expand from that. He's also lost a couple of areas, Kherson, for instance, that were quite important for him in order to keep that land bridge. But he hasn't lost footing in those areas entirely. So there is still significant Russian presence, of course, also in Luhansk and Donetsk, and there is still a continuation in terms of the land area between Crimea and Russia. So this is what the conflict will ultimately be about next year, although some people have been saying that while there's that conflict going on, there's the potential for a new offensive by the Russian forces early this year now, because we're already in 2023. So we'll see whether that materializes. There have been discussions between the Russian president, also the Belarusian president, that seem to suggest that perhaps there could be an attack coming from the north again, but we'll have to see whether that materializes or not.
So thank you, Kristen. You were talking about the Russia and Europe and the advancement the Russia, the people or the scholars are expecting from Russian side. So in this conflict or this situation, this scenario brings me to my next question that is related to the energy security. As we all know, that Europe is heavily dependent on the gas supplies or the fuel supplies from the Russia. So how you assess this scenario, particularly in this context of expansioning or advancement by the Russian forces?
Yes, so of course, over the last couple of years, the relationship between Europe and Russia was primarily characterized by one that isn't an antagonistic relationship, but that had been a relationship of mutual trade benefits and so on. So in that sense, what we saw over the last 20, 30 years, but in fact, if we look at the Russian energy pipeline, the first Russian energy pipeline from the Soviet Union at the time to Germany came in the 1970s. And it pays off to remember why it happened in the 1970s. It was a direct response to the blockade of Saudi Arabia and other countries in the 1970s in terms of energy supply. So it was a direct response that Russia was the country, or the Soviet Union at the time, was a replacement of the Middle Eastern oil for Western countries in Europe in particular. So that started that mutual interdependence between the West, in particular Western Europe and the Soviet Union, was then continuing to be built on when it came to Nord Stream 2, between, at the time, the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder and also President Putin. Ultimately, even building a second Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 2, that was pretty much finished in terms of building it, but it was never actually opened because then the war started and the German government refused to give permission to start the pipeline. Now that created a number of issues. Now for Europe, of course, it's true, Europe is energy dependent on Russia. It has, over the last 12 months, massively reduced that dependency, but it is still, relatively speaking, and it depends which European country we look at, in particular, some more, others a little bit less, but in general, Russian gas has been very important for the European economy, has been very important for Western European countries, but also Eastern European countries. By the same token, Russia is even more dependent on Western European consumers, because of course, while Russia, let's say, was making something like 50% of German energy supply in terms of gas, if we look at the reverse, Europe was making up something like, I don't know, 70-80% of Russian trade. So in a sense, it was for Russia, it was also very, and in fact, if you remember, Russia was very much pointing out that fact a number of years ago when people were saying, oh, no, you should be a little bit careful with Russian gas. The Russians were always saying, but you don't have to worry because, we are as dependent on you as you are on me. Nowadays, they don't make that statement anymore, but obviously it is still true that Russia was also very, very dependent on European consumers. Now, the question that the Russians and
you were saying Russia was dependent, so Russia is not dependent. This is what I should interpret.
Russia at the moment is in a process of a collapsing economy. So, in the sense that it is obviously, if the economy was still going as usual, it would still be dependent on Western Europe. And of course, Western Europe is working very, very hard at the moment in terms of reducing that dependency. But what the nice statement of reducing dependency means basically is the ending of the Russian business model, because there's only one outcome of a reduction of European energy dependence, that is the destruction of the Russian business model. Because once Europe has managed to diversify its energy resources away from Russia, Russia is very much at the mercy of China. It already is. But the problem that Russia has is, even if it wanted to sell all of the gas, let's say, to China, which it always says that it wants to do, selling gas is not as simple as, sending you a couple of products in a truck, because you can't send gas on a truck. Yeah, it goes through pipelines, and pipelines need an enormous amount of investment that comes over decades. That is an enormous amount of undertaking. And currently, it has those pipelines with Europe. It doesn't have those pipelines with China, which means that if Russia wants to sell to China tomorrow, it will find out that it will take decades to build that kind of relationship with China, as it has done with Europe, not since yesterday, but since the 1970s. So this is something of a double-edged sword for both parties. It is potentially problematic. The Europeans see that in terms of having high inflation and having high prices, notably through increased energy prices. The Russians see that in terms of having a reduction of income. Right now, the reduction of income hasn't been noticed as much because, of course, while the production has gone down, the price has gone up, which meant that the income hasn't gone down by as much as the supply of the energy has gone down. But obviously, as we're continuing down that track, and if that continues, let's say for 5-6 years, at that point, the Russian business model is dead. At that point, also, there is no way to revive it anymore, because in a sense, when the Europeans are bringing in alternative energy sources to the Russian gas, it means then they will have contracts with those other suppliers, for instance, Qatar, for instance, Saudi, and so on, who are going to be very happy to supply and who are not going to be interested that Europe shifts back to Russia. So in that sense, this is a long-term structural problem that Russia will face. For Europe, it's a short-term significant problem. But once that short-term problem is over, in a sense, the long-term strategic issue is actually with Russia, because Russia will need 20-30 years to build up the capacity to deliver that to other customers like China or possibly India or other countries. But it will not have the money to do so quickly. So it will be dependent on, let's say, Chinese investment to actually build those pipelines, which means that Russia will be totally at the mercy of other powers. So in that sense, it will be very, very problematic for Russia if they continue down that path.
So to conclude in one sentence, that the structural problem will be in disadvantage of Russian authorities or Russian Federation in long term, but it is not for the European countries. They are building and they're developing relations with Turkey and Greece, and they're trying to install the pipelines and establish those links, and that will eventually, in my humble assessment, that will lead Turkey an entry to the European Union. Do you agree with this?
Well, Turkey is an important country for the European Union in many, many ways. But of course, when it comes to energy, it will continue to become more and more important because it has a nice geographic location that it's important for a number of energy sources, irrespective of which part of the world they're coming from. If they're coming from Central Asia, if they're coming from the Middle East, Turkey is kind of nicely positioned geographically to be important for all of those issues. So, of course, Turkey will be an important country for the European Union for many, many years. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, among other things, is that Russia has created a problem for itself because the interdependency between Russia and European countries is such that Russia has a greater need for them than they will eventually have for Russia.
Yes, that is exactly what the Europeans are thinking, and that's exactly why the Europeans never thought Russia would actually invade, because they thought the strategic gamble is too harmful for Russia that you would want to go through with it. They were wrong. The Russians have a great capacity to endure pain, and I think everybody knows that. And that's what the Russian government is also banking on, that the Russian citizens have a great capacity to endure pain. But strategically, this was a terrible decision for the Russian Federation. Strategically, it is harming themselves in such a way that that they will feel long-term consequences over the next 30-50 years.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to move on to a slightly different topic, or a different topic now, related, but climate change, of course, is a major issue throughout the world, and three countries that greatly contribute to climate change are Russia, the US, and China. Will there be any impact on the relationship between those countries and the countries of the European Union because of Russian, US, and Chinese climate issues?
Yes, I mean, this will be a very, very complicated one to watch for the next couple of years because, of course, the Russian business model, just as the business model of a number of Middle Eastern countries, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Qatar, such as potentially Iran, if it were to have the sanctions lifted at some point, is obviously to sell a lot of gas and oil. Now, those are precisely the kind of areas that the Europeans want to reduce because, of course, they are leading to pollution and they're leading massively towards climate change. And of course, the Europeans, the Americans, and the Chinese are the primary consumers of that particular fossil fuel, which means that the relationship here is quite complicated because the Chinese interests, the European interests, American interests, they can be aligned at times and they can be diverging at other times, in a sense that obviously for all of them, they need to continue to have energy supply because they're producing a lot of goods, therefore they need continued energy supply. But a shift towards renewables is of course bad for countries that have as their business model to sell fossil fuel, right? I mean, this is very clear, so it's not in their interest. Now, the United States is a country where there is very clearly a division in the political spectrum as to what they should do about it. Because of course, the United States, on the one hand, is a big energy consumer. On the other hand, is also a big energy producer, partially also fossil fuels. And the Biden administration wants to shift the energy production. They want to shift big time from fossil fuel to renewables. So that is part of Biden's big plan, if you like, to shift and make America one of the leading renewable energy producers. Now, if they manage that shift, then the alignments, globally speaking, will shift very much, where America becomes much more closely aligned with Europe, that is also aiming to achieve precisely that, but is perhaps not doing that with the same amount of monetary investment as the Americans are trying to do at the moment, and could potentially also see some sort of alignment with China that is interested in receiving a lot of that type of energy, but also reducing, of course, consumption, because, of course, in Asia, climate change has some of the worst damages in terms of the kind of impact that climate change has. But of course, this is to the detriment of those that have a different type of business model, that are not going to be particularly enamored by those ideas, and that is very clear, and we're seeing that. If, on the other hand, we're seeing a shift back towards President Trump, if he should gain a second term, we would see a very different behavior of the United States. We would see the behavior of trying to push, of course, fossil fuels far more, oil and gas and everything else, which would bring America then in much more alignment with countries like Saudi Arabia, like Russia, like the oil and gas producing countries. So this is something to be seen in the future, but certainly the alignments here, the way global competition goes, is not very clearly aligned with the way, in a sense, climate change drives geopolitics in a way that obviously, depending on the decisions that are being taken, renewables would be driving global politics either.
You mentioned that Biden wants to increase renewables, but there is division in the United States government, which certainly there is. And of course, if Trump were to be reelected, as you mentioned, that would be, renewables would be out the window. But even now, with the current administration and the current way the government is set up, it's going to be a slow transition, if it occurs at all, to renewables. But at least it's moving that direction. At least nominally, which is a good thing. I wanted to go into another issue, and that's immigration policy. Of course, people are on the move around the world. They are escaping climate change and the impacts of that. They're escaping wars and poverty and all kinds of conditions. And they're coming in large numbers to Europe. And I do know that many European countries are, I think, in my view, hiding behind national security statements and issues to prevent many migrants from coming. How do you see immigration policy throughout European countries as, how do you see it playing out? How do you see it impacting security if it does? How do you see it changing the environment in European countries in any way? If you just broadly tell us about your view on immigration policy throughout Europe?
Yes, I mean, obviously it's very important to distinguish between kind of refugee and asylum and general immigration for the labor market. If we look at the kind of conflictual situation that we have in the world, in particular what happened in Ukraine, we see that in terms of refugees, we've had the largest stream of refugees in Europe since the Second World War. In some areas of Ukraine, the depopulation of the people there in Ukraine was, in percentage term, worse than even during the Second World War. So this is a very, very significant refugee crisis of a scale that we haven't seen at least since the Second World War, potentially more than that. So that is, the Europeans have responded in a way that I would say was more than generous, in the sense that they opened the visa requirements for Ukrainians in the European Union. Ukrainians can come. They are welcome at any point. Obviously, if you're male and you're Ukrainian, you're not allowed to leave Ukraine because you're meant to fight against the invader. But from a European perspective, legally speaking, you are now allowed to come into the European Union in any European country, and you are to provide at least temporary shelter. And we've seen very, very significant amounts of people that have actually made it into Europe already. I think some figures are talking about 8 million, some people are talking about 10 million. It depends a little bit how you calculate the figures. It depends also in which direction you calculate them. So we've seen really very, very significant numbers that we haven't seen since the Second World War. Now, when it comes to immigration policy per se, that's something that is much more contentious. Much more contentious in the sense that a number of European countries have refused to accept that they have become immigration countries, that they need immigration for the labor market. And this is something of a dysfunction in the labor market and in a number of European countries that still continues to exist, that they pretend that they don't need migration that much in order to keep the labor market going, but really they do, because we're seeing population reductions and so on. We're seeing people leaving the labor market, so we actually need more people on the labor market. So that is something that is the case. Now, whether that's going to change over the next couple of years, it's a difficult one. I'm not seeing that on the horizon immediately. We're seeing that certainly the pandemic certainly contributed to a number of far-right groupings in different European countries. Russia itself, of course, also finances a lot of those far-right groupings that are also helping, and that are sometimes directly supported by the Kremlin, sometimes indirectly supported by the Kremlin, sometimes directly financed by the Kremlin. For instance, Salvini and the Lega, that was all over the Italian newspapers. There were even tapes in terms of how the Russian gas was supporting Salvini. We know that Marine Le Pen, for instance, in France, who came very close to becoming French president, but lost ultimately, but not by so much, against Emmanuel Macron. Her entire presidential campaigns twice was financed by a Kremlin bank. So we see that kind of in a number of different European countries. So we see that growing. That is going to make the environment more complicated. That is going to make the environment more complicated to have a more open migration policy. But at the same time, you know, in a moment we're in a conflict situation, we're in a crisis situation. So a lot of things appear in a particular way, but we'll have to see what happens when that crisis goes down again. We saw something similar when it came to the euro and the Greek crisis at the time. Once the crisis kind of abated, then also the opinion polls for a number of the far-right groups went down again as well, at least until the COVID crisis and so on. So we'll have to see what happens precisely, but for now, the environment is one that is more complicated, but also it's an environment where there's already quite a lot of people on the move. Certainly a number of Ukrainians that are already in various European countries. I think there were 6 million just in Poland alone, and then there's several other million in other European countries. So very significant numbers that we're dealing with. So we'll have to see how the environment develops when the crisis is over.
Okay, so you talked about the crisis, of course, the Ukrainian crisis, and many Ukrainian refugees have been accepted, as you mentioned, millions and millions. But in the last few years, there have been countless numbers of Syrians fleeing terrible conditions, and they are not being welcomed in many European countries. People in Afghanistan have been fleeing even since before the US left, and they're not being accepted. And people throughout the global South who are suffering from policies that are mainly, they're being impacted by global North policies in their countries, and they're not being accepted. Why is Europe willing to accept so many Ukrainian refugees, but is trying to prevent, in many regards, refugees from these other countries, such as Syria, for example, from coming into their borders? Is it security issues? Is it economic issues? Or is there something else coming into play?
I mean, a number of those issues, to an extent, were coincidental, if you like. I mean, Europe wasn't, let's say, saying all the Syrian refugees come into Europe, so that's certainly not the case. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget, during the 2015-2016 crisis, Europe did accept between 2 and 3 million people. That Germany alone had 1.6 million or 1.8 million, something in that region. A number of other countries were also accepting at a lesser scale than Germany did, but still also accepting. So it's not that they didn't accept any, they accepted quite a large chunk. But of course, the view in a lot of European Union countries was that, well, they should kind of stay in their region of origin, if you like. And in fact, if you look at the Ukrainians, the same is actually true. You know, the most of the Ukrainians are in fact in Poland, so they're still staying in their region of origin also. It's just that their region of origin happens to be inside the European Union, where let's say if we talk about the Syrians, their region of origins might be, let's say, in Jordan, or might be in Turkey, or might be somewhere close to Europe, but not quite in Europe. So in that sense, it's not actually as different as people perceive it to be, because it just happens to be that Poland is actually a member of the European Union. If Poland wasn't a member of the European Union, you would actually find that a lot of Ukrainians are also not in the European Union. But because 6 million are in Poland, it means those 6 million are inside the European Union. If we look at other European countries apart from Poland, actually the picture is not so vastly different. There's still more Ukrainians that are accepted than, let's say, Syrians or Afghanis, but it's not so vastly more. If you take out just the one outlier, which is Poland, and you take that one out, actually the difference is much, much, much smaller. In addition to that, obviously, we had also governments that had initially welcomed a lot of Syrian refugees. So, for instance, the Erdogan government at the time, he said, come on, my brother should come into Turkey. And in fact, he had initially an open arms policy. But then, of course, his government was also not expecting to receive quite as many as eventually came, right? They probably thought maybe 15-20% of those people would come, but not all of those that eventually did come. And then what we saw actually is that in the Turkish policy, we saw a similar discourse developing as we saw in Western Europe. That was talk about refugees being a burden to society, of kind of holding back the economy, and similar kind of issues like you see them also in Western Europe. They were also developing in Turkey. And we saw that then there was an interesting incentive, of course, for President Erdogan to say, you know what, why don't you go to Greece? Why don't you go to Western Europe? And in fact, he then also pushed them out. Then they came to an agreement that he said, okay, you give me some money, you give me some political favors, and in return, I'm going to keep some, but I'm giving you some of them, but not all of them. And, you know, they came with some sort of medium-term solution, but of course, it's a solution that is, you know, It's not a solution for those people necessarily. It's a solution for him and his own political environment, and for the Europeans, of course. At the time, for German Chancellor Angela Merkel, this was very important because she was getting quite a large number of refugees that she was accused in the media and in the political spectrum of, why are you so generous, and this is against our interest, and so on. So it was a very strong political problem. So there was a meeting of mind, and they managed to find an agreement in that way. But ultimately, it's not a long-term solution, because a long-term solution would involve a situation that is more peaceful in both Syria and Afghanistan, that gives those people the opportunity to actually go back to their country.
Listen,
we're not there yet.
Listen, you have discussed very aptly about the people who are displaced due to the international power politics. But there is some another problem that are almost, there are 8 to 9 minorities, or the people whose rights are in turbulent, are in jeopardy in European Union. For example, the Roma people, or the Gypsies, they are suffering heavily. It is not even reported in the British media, or not in the Western media, not internationally. They were not getting the projection or the coverage they deserve. So in this attitude, there are 2 attitudes: one towards the internationally displaced people, and the second is the locally displaced people. How you see this attitude towards the both people?
I mean, the Gypsies, one shouldn't call them, because that's a kind of a pejorative term, but the Roma and Sinti people, I mean, their situation is a little bit different in the sense that, legally speaking, they have all the rights of a citizen. Legally speaking, they have a passport, whether that is, let's say, a Hungarian passport, whether that is a Slovak passport, a Czech passport, a Romanian passport, a Bulgarian passport. They have, in a sense, all the rights of an EU citizen. And it's more a problem of discrimination against minorities, like you were just pointing out. There's in fact discrimination happening, but it's not that they are displaced, if you like. It's not that they're not allowed to stay where like, it's not that people are.
So if there is already discrimination in the society or the structure, so will it not be increased against the internationally displaced citizens, or internationally displaced people who are settling in Europe? Will it not make the environment more toxic?
It can do. I mean, so far,
for a non-native European.
Yeah, it can do. It can do. It depends a little bit on the circumstances. I mean, so far what we've had is, if we look at the countries where the majority of the Roma and Sintis are, they're not the countries where a lot of the refugees are. So they're not in the same country. So in that sense, they're not in direct competition, because, like I said, a lot of the Ukrainians are actually in Poland, and a number of them are also in Germany. That's not the 2 countries where a lot of the Sinti and Roma are. The countries where a lot of the Sinti and Roma are more in the Balkans. They're more in parts of Eastern Europe and so on. But they're not necessarily that many Ukrainians in those countries. But you could imagine a hypothetical situation where you have another big migration wave, and this is completely imaginable in the next couple of months. It is also something that the Russians are working towards when they're kind of killing all of the infrastructure and so on. So in that particular situation, you could see yet another wave of refugees coming, and that could also then involve other countries primarily. It could shift a lot towards Romania, it could shift towards Bulgaria, it could shift towards Hungary. All of that is a possibility, and in those cases they would start entering into a competition. Now, larger scale issues are, of course, that those competitions can exist, and that there can be, if you like, a toxic environment developing. I don't think we have seen it yet. I don't think so far the environment has massively changed. I mean, the kind of discrimination that we've discussed with Roma and Sintis is a long-term issue. This is something that hasn't happened over the last 10 years. It hasn't happened over the last 20 years. It's an issue that has happened over the last 300-400 years. So it's really a long-term issue that in Europe we've had to deal with in a number of countries, and this discrimination is obviously not going to go away in a matter of a couple of years, even if the European Union, with all good intention, comes in and brings in policies to help that against that discrimination. That doesn't mean that it's going to disappear in the next couple of years, because of course those are systemic issues that have been around for quite a while. But at least the European Union has started addressing some of those issues. So we say they've started developing policies to support the Romas and to support the Sintis and so on in the discrimination issues. And we'll have to see whether this is going to help and how fast this will help and so on. But in principle, you're right. A competition could happen. A competition could occur. So far, I don't think we've seen it, but it who knows what tomorrow will bring. So it is something that could happen.
Thank you, Kristen, for shedding the light on the human rights problem and the immigration issue or immigration policy of European Union. But sorry, I had a follow-up question related to the climate change question that I want to ask now. Is about you mentioned about the consumption of fossil fuels and converting and taking benefit of energy out of them. But most of the fossil fuels produced by even if it was for producing from Middle East, China, Russia, they are consumed by the European consumers. So how you see that? Because the second arrangements the European Union are making is from Turkey or Greece is also burning fossil fuels for energy purposes. So how you see this policy? Because we all know and we respect that the European Union is the largest voice and the stakeholder when it comes to advocating climate change.
Yes, I mean, it is a long-term issue. I mean, the Europeans are saying they're making the bet that in order to reduce energy consumptions, we can't reduce it in the way in which we would need to reduce it in order to reduce the increase in terms of world temperature. So therefore, we will need to produce our energy, at least in parts, in a different way. That's where the alternative energy comes from. That's where the kind of more green energy idea comes from. But of course, the green energy is not something that you can just it's not like a tap that you can just switch on and it's there. It requires a lot of investment. It requires a lot of strategic decisions. So obviously on the European side, there's the acknowledgement that while you're pushing the economy towards green energy, there's going to be a transition period where you're going to need other fossil fuels. Now then the question is, from whom are you going to get? They made the bet at some point that the best way to have this transition period is to get Russian oil and gas. Now that bet is off. I think that's been decided. So now the bet is a little bit more hedged. So there's different possibilities there. There's Qatar on the horizon. There's Turkey. There's Greece and others. There's possibility also of West Africa and potentially producing it there. But the idea for the Europeans is that this is going to be a temporary solution, that this is not something like, for instance, you saw the haggling between Germany and Qatar in terms of some of the energy supplies over the duration of the contract. It wasn't so much about the volume of the contract, it was over the duration of the contracts, because the Germans in their mindset said we want to have a medium-term solution and then we want to move towards the renewables. The Qataris say, yeah, but we can sell it to somebody else for much longer term. We want stability in our sale. And so, there's certain compromises that need to be made on the way. And I think that's what they're trying to do at the moment. The idea is that eventually they will reduce the dependency entirely. But obviously, this is a process of 20, 30 years. This is not something that you just do in a couple of months.
Thank you, Christian, for giving us your time. This brings me to the last question of our podcast, that is about the relationship of United Kingdom and the European Union. So we have seen, we are hearing voices in United Kingdom that Brexit should not have happened. It has not benefited us in terms of political stability. We are unstable politically since the Brexit issue started. and that has impacted the economy. And these are the domestic problems. And then there comes the international issues. They are facing policy challenges to coordinate with the European Union, to coordinate with America, to coordinate with Russia, to these things. So how you see, is there, if I ask this hypothetically, is there any chance that United Kingdom will go back and join European Union again? Or what policy United Kingdom will adopt if not joining the European Union?
Yes, I would be a little bit cautious about that. I think certainly in terms of the population, you see a very significant element of Brexit regret, or regret, as some people are coining it now. So you see that quite significantly in the opinion polls that I've just seen recently. 2/3 of all people in the United Kingdom would like to see another referendum on rejoining the European Union. So this is something that will occupy our minds for the next couple of years. Now, the problem that you have is we're going to see a massive discrepancy between the population, where you might see support, and the political spectrum that is not going to be interested in that. On the Tory party side, well, very clearly they're not interested in that. They've styled themselves into the Brexit party, the party that has actually, delivered Brexit. That was the way in which Prime Minister Boris Johnson won the last election. So it's part of the Tory party identity now. So that will be very difficult to kind of convince Tory voters that this is no longer what they should be standing for. On the Labour side, the Labour leadership, Keir Starmer, is very, very cautious about wanting to promise anything in relation to the European Union. For now, he is basically promising to make it better than the Tories, but not really saying how it would make it very different. So for now, his bet is, in order to win the marginal seats that he needs to win in order to become prime minister, he better not say too much about Brexit, and certainly not about reversing Brexit. As a result of that, the opinion polls that seem to show the regret are not really factoring into the political spectrum as yet. Now, once the next elections are over, I think things might start to develop. Once the next elections are over, we will see that perhaps a new Labour government might change the environment. They might start talking more positively about the European Union. They might start talking about how Britain can link up to the European Union much more. And I think that might be the key over time. Now, whether that leads to Britain rejoining the European Union, I'm not sure that that is necessarily the right approach. Because also from the European Union's point of view, I don't know whether that's necessarily in the European Union's interest to have a country as a member that can't make its mind up as to whether it wants to be part of it or not. I think from the European Union's point of view, it might be better to have a very close partner that is happy to be a close partner than to have a member state that isn't quite sure whether it wants to be one or not. So from the European Union perspective, it might be better to have a close economic and political relationship with the United Kingdom that doesn't necessarily involve being a member. And I have the impression that the political spectrum in Britain might be shifting towards that as well. Now, from a British point of view, I think actually it might be better to be a member than just being a close cooperation partner. Because from a British point of view, being a member means you can shape the rules. If you're a close partner, you're taking the rules. You're not shaping them, you're just accepting them. So from a British point of view, actually being a member is preferable to being a close partner. But I'm not sure the political spectrum is necessarily going in that direction. And I'm not entirely sure that the European Union would necessarily want that either. So I'm not sure that we're going to see Britain rejoining the European Union in the next legislature. What happens after that, who knows? So many things can happen in life. People shouldn't give their forecasts of anything that is beyond the next 12 to 24 months, because it's difficult to get that one right. But otherwise, I think, yeah, about the legislature, I would say I would feel confident enough to say that Britain is not rejoining.
Okay. Christian, thank you very much for this conversation today. It's been very informative to me and to our listeners. We're very grateful for you spending the time to share your expertise and answer these questions. as we all look forward to whatever is going to happen in 2023. And as you said, it's difficult to make predictions, but we can make some educated guesses, and your expertise is much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It was a pleasure to be there with you.
Thank you,
you.
Chris, for your time.
Thank you. Take care.